introduce the next speaker, I want you to check out the following. Just grab your phones. Don't worry, it's not a quiz. It's not a quiz. All right, so you can see that's reactforbeginners.com. You can see the little banner on top, right? Does that look like Nigerian flag? Okay, so that's reactforbeginners.com. So for folks that are trying to learn React, you can actually sign up, and then because you're a Nigerian, you're going to pay far less than you should have paid. Oh yes, oh yes. You can also check out es6.io. It's the same privilege you're going to have. Then you can check out learnnode.com if you're trying to learn how to use Node.js and Express and MongoDB to build like JavaScript applications. Same privilege. One person providing all these courses, making it very affordable for us Nigerians. That's exciting. And then there are some other courses also, but these ones are free. For example, if you want to learn CSS Grid, you can check out cssgrid.io. It's a free video course for learning how to use CSS Grid. If you want to learn Sublime, you can check out sublimetextbook.com. If you also want to learn how to use Flexbox in your UIs, you can check out flexbox.io. You want to be a ninja in using the command line, you can check out commandlinepoweruser.com. I can go on and on. If you want to learn how to use Redux, before you come to GraphQL, you can go to learnredux.com. It's a free course too. If you want to learn how to use Markdown, masteringmarkdown.com. Now, all these websites that I just talked about was built by one person. All the courses by one person. Wesboss is an incredible instructor. If you have gone through Wesboss courses before, or his books, or his blog posts, you know it's very incredible. And Wesboss will be talking about CSS Grid today. Hey, Wesboss.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, you can take it away now.
Awesome. That was probably the best intro I've ever had before. So thank you so much for that. Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming out. Maybe one day I'll be able to come all the way over there. I think that'd be pretty cool. Today I'm going to be talking about CSS Grid. Actually, a lot of my examples are I usually use like a laser pointer when I give this, but because it's remote, I was like, how do I like show what's going on? And so I put this little Santa hand where my cursor is. So hopefully you can see where it is, and when I highlight rows and columns, hopefully that's going to help a little bit better. So the slides that I have today are going to have lots of code on them. This is going to be a very nuts and bolts talk about CSS Grid. So I'm going to tweet out the link shortly after this. I'll also post it in the Slack room if you're looking at grabbing it. So I don't need to, my introduction was way better than I could do. So I make web development courses for a living. I like to teach people what we have, blah, 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 blah. I got a whole bunch. I also have a podcast that's called Syntax at syntax.fm. But today I'm going to talk to you about CSS Grid. It's more of a talk-torial. What I want you to do is to leave with a good idea of what CSS Grid is, when to use it, and all of the different pieces, because CSS Grid has a huge surface area. There's a lot that actually goes into using CSS Grid, and quite frankly, it's not hard to learn, but it's a lot to learn at once. So what is CSS Grid? It's a new layout system in CSS. It's not a framework. It's not a library. It's an addition to the language that allows us to quickly create flexible, two-dimensional layouts, and that's really important. We'll talk about that in just a second. So the core ideas behind CSS Grid is that you've got like kind of two things. You've got your parent, which is a grid, and that's usually like a div or any element really. But let's assume it's a div. And then inside of that, you have items, and those are the direct child. Like Flexbox, there's a direct parent-child relationship that we have here. So first thing you need to do is define a grid. So you grab a div and you can slice it up into rows and into columns, and then you can also add in some grid gap. And then what you do is you go ahead and put some items inside of that grid that you have. So here I've just taken that 9 slotted grid, I've made 9 items, and they slot themselves inside of it. So let's take a look at what that code actually looks like behind that. So first thing we need to do is you display grid on top of or on your actual element that you have. And that will change it from the default block or inline or table or whatever it is normally, and you can display it as grid. And then you go ahead and slice it up via rows and columns. So here what I've done is I've said, give me 1 column that's 200, 1 column that's 300, 1 column that's 100, and then give me 3 rows that are 200, 300, 100 as well. Additionally, we have this new property called grid gap, which is 20px, and that will give us space in between it. It is going to be standardized as just gap pretty soon, which will allow us to use it in Flexbox as well, because this is one thing that we don't have in Flexbox. You still have to use margin or padding or something like that to get it to work. So let's break it down. We've got tracks first. And tracks are the name that we use to collectively call these things both a row and a column. So when we refer to a track, I mean it's either a row side to side or a column top to bottom. So what we do is we can display grid to slice it up with columns. Like we said, we can define as many columns as we want, and that'll give us that many columns. And then you can go ahead and slice it up in the rows that you want. Here I've done 3 columns across, 2 rows top to bottom, and that's what our grid looks like. So the items inside of it by default are going to span just one grid spot that we have. So a grid can be anything that we have. It could be a div, a paragraph, an image, a header tag, a section tag. Any element can be defined as a grid. And same with the grid items. Anything inside of it can be defined as an item. If you do have something that is inside of your grid item that is larger than your actual rigid grid structure, we'll talk about how to get around this in just a second, then it will obviously overflow over top of that. Now, one of the core ideas behind wrapping your head around how CSS Grid works, and really in making a flexible grid, because it's not always the case that you can sit here and slice up your div into exactly the amount of spots that you know. A lot of times you don't know how many spots you're going to have inside of your grid. So that's this core idea of the implicit grid versus the explicit grid. So the best way to understand what the difference between those two things are is to answer the question, what happens when we have more items than we actually have slots? So here I have 3 columns. There we go, Santa hand. Ready? 1, 2, 3 columns and 2 rows. 1, 2. But we have this poop and this pointer we got right here. Where do those go, right? Because I only defined 2 rows, 100, 100, and then there's this extra one that's being added here. And that's the difference between the implicit and the explicit grid. So if we take a look at these dotted lines here, this is Firefox DevTools. Firefox actually sponsored me on my CSS Grid course. It's at cssgrid.io. It's totally free because Firefox sponsored it. And they have these awesome dev tools that allow you to visualize what's going on with your grid, because you can only stare at the CSS code for so long without actually understanding what's going on with your grid. So see this solid line at the bottom right here? What that's doing is it's signifying where the explicit grid ends and the implicit grid then starts. So the idea behind this is that once you run out of defined grid spots, the explicit ends and the implicit grid starts. So right here, I've only defined 2 rows like we did earlier. However, we have this one extra item that's going to spill out. What does the browser do with it? Well, it stops the explicit grid. We're done. And then starts what's called the implicit grid. The height of a row in your implicit grid is defined by the actual content that you have. So here I've got some large text. It's making the row much higher than it would be if it was just a poop emoji in there. And unless you set the height of the implicitly created rows, the content is going to define what it looks like. However, we have this new property in CSS called Grid Auto Rows 300px. And what that will do is it'll say any automatically created rows, any implicitly created rows will be 300 pixels high, right? So this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's all part of the explicit grid. Those are all spots that we made ourselves, right? But these two right here, those are accidents, right? Or those are spillover, as I like to say. So anything that is spillover, make them 300 pixels. You can even have a 100% implicit grid. So what I've done here is I've just display gridded. I've put no columns. So by default, a grid with no columns is one column. And then the second item is just going to spill out over top, right? So what we're doing here is we're saying anything that is automatically created, which is everything, be 100 pixels high. So that could be a good way just to, it's not really a grid, but you could just have a list of items and you could easily size them up. Now, let's talk about axes, because in Flexbox, we have the ability to change your axis from left to right to top to bottom and even right to left and bottom to top if you would like to do that. And it's actually dependent on the way that the words read in your language. With Grid, we don't have the ability to change the axes, but we do have the ability to change how additional spots are added. So I just got finished telling you that once the explicit spots are done, the new additional rows are created, right? But we can change this from adding additional rows in the implicit grid to adding additional columns in the implicit grid. So here is a grid, 4 items. I've defined no columns. I've defined no rows. So by default, it just adds the additional items as rows, right? But if we change that to grid auto flow column, what will happen here is it will automatically just add the new items as extra columns. And if you want, this will actually cause horizontal scrolling in your application because it will just keep going to the left. Here I've got a grid template column 100, 200. So 1 and 2 are 100 pixels and 200 pixels. And then I've said anything that's automatically created be 300 pixels. And because I've changed the axes from adding additional as rows to adding additional as columns, now 3 and 4 are automatically going to be sized at 300 pixels. I don't use that all the time because like very rarely do you want a horizontally scrolling website. Most things go top to bottom, but it can be helpful. Now, let's talk about sizing our actual tracks that we have here. You can specify the width and the height of rows with any existing CSS unit that we have. So whether that's pixels or rems or ems or viewport units, or even some of the weird ones that we have in CSS. We have inches in CSS or character height. You could use those if you really wanted to. One that you see fairly often is percentages, which we're going to talk a little bit about that because percentages are fine when they're used in combination with like pixels, or they're used in combination with the auto keyword. So here what I've done is I've got this green layout here, and I said 80% this column and auto the second column. But percentages are not for adding up to 100%. And if anyone's been a developer for, I don't know, like 8 years or something like that, maybe you can hoot and holler if you've been a developer that long. Do you remember the good old days of having to add up like a percentage div, like a sidebar and a content, and then you had like some like margin and padding, or you had padding on each of those, but they were in pixel values, and then you had to like, you couldn't add them up, right? Because 80% plus 20% plus 20 pixels, like those are apples and oranges. How do I add those two up, right? And what ends up happening is, here, let me actually have to zoom out for this one. There we go. You see, I've got 80%, 20%, and I've got grid gap, and you see that it's starting to spill outside of my grid container here. And that's because I'm over budget on the amount of space that I have to actually work with. So the solution is not to use percentages. The solution is to use a new unit in CSS called a fractional unit. And I like to think of these as free space units. So rather than using 80%, 20%, I can switch that to 8FR and 2FR. And what that's going to do is it's going to use up the remaining free space that we have. These units are proportional. They're very much like flex grow and flex shrink, in that I could have put 4FR and 1FR here at the exact same time, and they would be the exact same layout because they're proportional in relation to other FR units in that track. So the way that FR units work is that the browser will first, should I use my little pointer here, dedicate space towards the things that need a specific amount of room, existing content, fixed size tracks in grid gap. Then the remaining space will be divided up in proportion. So what the grid does is says, okay, I need 20 pixels for gap. Maybe I got an image in there that's 500 pixels wide. Okay, these things have a hard budget of space that we need to associate with them. Then what we can do is give the rest away in proportion. So what I've done here is I've said, we've got two hard budgets here. First, we need 50 px of grid gap right here and right here. Second, we need a 500 pixel column right here, right? So we've already used up 600 pixels of our budget. Now, we've got fun money left at the end of the day to work with. We're going to proportionally divide that extra space up via 2 times. So 1 and 4 will get 2 times the amount of free space as 3 and 6 because it's 2 FR and 1 FR. Now, let's take a look right here. This is grid template columns, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, right? You think like 3 free space units or 3 fractional units will give you 3 equal columns. That's actually not the case because remember that I said this item 2 has a hard width. So by divvying up things that need space first, and then it goes into additional extra space at the end of the day. Let's talk about the repeat function in CSS. It allows us to repeat things over and over. So instead of typing 1 FR 5 times, we simply just use this new function called repeat. So repeat 5 times over 1 FR, and that's going to give us the 5 columns that we need. It's really nice. It just saves you a little bit of typing. It can be used multiple times. So here I've said repeat 3 times 1 FR, 1, 2, 3, and then repeat 2 times 3 FR, 1, 2, right? So you can put as many repeats in a normal grid template column as you wish. You can mix them with other units. So 200 pixels, then repeat 3, 1, 2, 3, and then give myself another 200 pixels. Let's talk about sizing items. I think that this is along with the grid template columns. I'm not going to get to absolutely everything that CSS Grid has to offer just because of time constraints. You can obviously take my course as well. But this is a pretty important piece of CSS Grid other than initially defining the layout. So if you actually size a specific item, here I've sized item number 3 as 300 pixels wide. It's going to expand that entire track, which is not necessarily what we want because it brings everything in that row or that column along for the ride. So what we can do is we can, this is another example. If you have a 600 pixel one and you have a rigid size track 100 px, then you're kind of out of luck here because it's going to spill out. So in most cases, the best way to size a grid item is to span multiple grid spots. So here what I've done is I've taken that number 3 and I've said that the column of the item itself is to span 3 spots, and that's going to take up 3 grid spots itself. If the item is too large to fit in, so if I try to span it 4 and there's only 3 spots, it will break onto the next track and begin looking for space on that line. You'll see that these additional spots are then left. That problem with the additional spots, so 1, 2, empty, 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 3, the way that we can solve that is by saying grid auto flow dense. And the way that the browser fixes that is that we say 1, 2, 3 doesn't fit here, so break onto the next line. Now it's time to paint 4, and grid auto flow dense will always put it back to the start of the grid and look for extra spots that it could squeeze itself in. It says, "Ooh, I could fit 4, 5, 6 right here," and then it continues on with 7. So it does rearrange the order, but it packs them as dense as it possibly can. In CSS Grid, we have this thing called line numbers. So if you are trying to put something specifically on a track, the numbers in CSS Grid are not numbered by the columns or the rows themselves. They're numbered by the gutters. So you're always going to have, so here we have 4 line numbers, you're always going to have one more number than you actually do tracks. So that's really cool because we can explicitly state where our items are going to go by saying grid column, and this is a start-stop syntax that we have here. Start at line 2 and end at line 5. And you can also use negative numbers here where you can say grid row, start at line 4 and end at, and negative numbers will anchor you not from the start of the grid, but from the end of the grid. So -1 means span to the end of the explicit grid. This is really handy. This is something I use all the time. If you have an item and you want to span it across the entire width of the grid, you simply just say grid column, start at 1, end at -1, and that's going to span the entire width of the grid, regardless of how many columns that you actually have. You can specify where items end instead. So here, if we look at the end properties, grid column end 5, so end at the 5th column, and grid row end -1. So I've sort of anchored it at the bottom right-hand corner right here, and then you can just span them up and over from there. So you can say span 3 over and span 5 high, and you can anchor them from the bottom up, which is really handy if you know where you want it to end, but you don't know where you want it to start. Now, there's also a couple more properties that we have here called auto fit and auto fill. Let's say we have a grid with a flexible width. You don't know how wide it is. Like every website, you don't know really how wide you have it. How many 100 pixel tracks can you fit in to an unknown width? You don't know unless you know the explicit width. So what we can do here is we can use the repeat, not repeat 7, but repeat autofill, which means repeat as many times as you possibly can fit them in there and make them all 100 pixels high. And then when you change the width of the actual grid, then just less items are going to be able to fit in it, and we don't have to define an explicit amount of columns or rows in there. The difference between auto fit and auto fill is that we've got extra. If we have extra space, the question is that should we still dice that extra space up into extra columns? So in auto fit, you don't get extra columns or rows, and in auto fill, you do. And almost always I use auto fill because it's helpful to have these extra slots. Like let's say this was a sign out button, and I wanted to anchor the sign out button on the very right-hand side, and then these were all navigation items. I could just say grid column, -1, and anchor it at the very right-hand side. So why do we have this auto fit and auto fill? It's because we have another function in CSS that's called min-max, and we can kind of guess what it does. It takes 2 arguments, which is a min and a max. And this is something I'm going to get probably tattooed on my chest because I use it so often. This is probably something you will write the most in CSS Grid. So grid template column, you're defining a grid, repeat, autofill, fit as many as you possibly can in, and make the items at a minimum 350 pixels wide and at a maximum 1 FR wide. And what that allows us to do is to have like kind of a responsive layout where if you've got the space, at a minimum, they're going to be 350 pixels wide, but at a maximum, they're going to be 1 FR. So you can see here, I'm not sure if it updates quick enough, but just as these items get to be 350 pixels, it goes, oh, I can't fit 2 on one line. So now I'm going to have to break them onto their own line. So we've got responsive without media queries. That's why it's awesome. They're container aware, which means that they're not based on the viewport like all media queries are. They're based on however wide the actual container, the wrapper div is. It's really, really handy. I probably use it the most thing in CSS Grid. Let's see how much time we got here left. I know we started a couple of minutes late. I think I got about 5 more minutes left. We'll get into grid template areas. Another way to define where your items go is to create what are called areas in your grid. So we've just said, okay, a couple of ways we can put our items is we can span them, we can start and stop them at line numbers, but we can also define the names of these areas. So the way that you use it is you define what via this crazy ASCII syntax where you can say head, 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 side, side, main, main, ads, main, and then footer across the top. You can kind of visualize what the website is going to look like. So that will give us something like this, where we have our header across the top, sidebar, ads, our main content, and a footer right across the bottom. Up here, we've got and this is the example that we have here. And the way that you assign items to the area is you simply take the grid item, you say grid area head, grid area main, ads, side, foot, and that puts them where you want. There's no starting and stopping or spanning. You just say, go in this area. And that's great because in a media query or in anywhere, you can change what the layout looks like, and it will simply just change it'll change the layout. And there's no need to span or to change any of the widths or the heights or the rows or anything like that. And that's cool because you can imagine at a responsive breakpoint wanting to rearrange what your app looks like, you could simply just rewrite your grid template area and everything else stays the same. When you name lines, what we're going to have here, I'm going to skip over the name lines part because you can look it up. I'm going to go real quick on just aligning elements because there are 6 different alignment properties in CSS Grid. You've got justify dash whatever, and those are your horizontal axes. And then you've got a line dash star, and those are for your vertical alignment. And we're going to be using this like simple grid as an example that we have here. So first one is justify content, and that's how you actually align the tracks inside of it. So you can center them. Like if you have a grid that has more space than the tracks, how do they align inside of the grid? That's the big question that we have. So you can center them. You can put them at the start. In Flexbox, this was Flex Start, but it's been simplified as just Start, which will be coming back to Flexbox as well. And obviously, space between, which is really cool. It will take the extra space and put it between the rows. And then we have space around, which will take the extra space and put it around them. So the difference between those two is, do you want it on the start and stop of it or not? Justify items, how you align the elements inside of the track. So by default, the item is just going to stretch to fit the width and the height of the actual track. But if inside of that track, you can align the items, you can center the item in the track, you can start the item in the track, you can end it. You can override on one single element. So you can say justify self, and that will override the justify items on a specific element. And then we have pretty much the exact same thing on your vertical axes, where by default you can stretch it, but you can center them, put them at the start, put them at the end, put them in the middle, put them between. You get the point, right? And then align items has the same thing where you can do it. So it's kind of, I think there's like thousands of different ways if you were to add them all up together, all the permutations of different ways that you can align things. This actually one is pretty cool. You can align all of the items at the bottom of the text. So if the text is different sizes in all of your items, you can all anchor them at the bottom of that text. And of course you can override. This is a big benefit over using Flexbox, which is you can override on both axes, where in Flexbox we only have the ability to override on one of the axes. So that's a lot. CSS Grid is huge. There's still so much more to CSS Grid. There's CSS Grid versus Flexbox. When do you use one or the other? They do have quite a bit of overlap, but they still each have their own spots. In most cases, I say CSS Grid wins out though. The real website use cases, I think there's actually a talk later today is let's stop looking at yellow boxes and let's look at some real use cases for using CSS Grid when we're building websites. Dev tools, mobile media queries, reordering elements, overlapping elements. That's cool. One cool thing about Grid is that it actually gets rid of having to position absolute most things or position fix most things, because you can actually overlap elements with CSS Grid. Dealing with unknown number of lines, dense block fitting, full page layout. CSS Grid is absolutely huge. It's a huge addition to the CSS spec. And if there's anything that I would recommend investing your time in learning in CSS right now, is Grid, because It's totally going to change the way we do layouts, but also make things much easier. So it's well worth learning, and I want to encourage everybody to get at it. And I don't actually have stickers because I'm not there, but I will soon. So thanks so much for listening to the talk. I'm not sure if we have time for any questions, but I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Wes. Any questions?
Hi, Wes Boss. Thanks for the amazing presentation. I used to see some developers used to combine both Flexbox and grid layouts to build sites. So I don't know, is it possible for us to use just CSS Grid so that I don't need to learn Flexbox? Thanks.
So in my course, I've got a video on CSS Grid versus Flexbox, and there's like a couple little edge cases, specifically where you are wrapping flex items and your two lines have different amounts of items in them, because grid is very much grid, row, and unless you span an item, they're all going to look exactly the same. Flexbox still excels at that, but people tend to say like, Flexbox is good for single axes, and grid is good for multiple axes when you have multiple lines and stuff like that. But the reality is that grid is also really good at just doing one single line. So if you had like a header of a component where you had like a title and like a description and a couple buttons and you wanted to align them perfectly, grid is really good for that. So I find myself reaching for grid in 90% of the use cases for aligning large layouts and small fiddly things. And then Flexbox still has a couple little edge cases, and you can check out my video specifically on what those things are.
All right, one more question. Okay.
Hi, Wes. So does CSS Grid scale to a large number of rows or columns, say in the couple hundreds or maybe a few thousands?
Yeah, there is a limit. Somebody tweeted it out. It's something like, I don't know, 47,000 items or something like that. There's a specific number of items, but you got to be really doing something. So hundreds and hundreds, yes, absolutely. Thousands and thousands, yes, absolutely. Hundreds of thousands, there's a limit at some point in Chrome where it just breaks. I'm not sure what it is.
A few thousands?
Yeah, there is a limit.
Okay, the other one then is, what's the characteristics for rendering for layout, paint, and render for grid items? So you wanted to use a couple of them for either rows or columns. Say you're embedding a few.
What do you mean, like the characteristics?
Okay, if you had, say, a couple hundred, let me not go too far into the thousands. You know, what's a rendering, the performance characteristics for rendering?
There can be problems because if you use FR, remember we talked about FR where it defines the space. Let's say you have an image that is not loaded yet, and then the image loads. That's going to trigger a re-render because that image, it doesn't know how large the image is. It's the same with regular CSS, where if you have an image and then the image loads and actually is its true size, then it triggers a re-render. And Flexbox has sort of the same problems where it could trigger 3 or 4 re-renders because of the flexible nature of it. So if you have something that may change like an image, it's best to go ahead and give it a hard width or some sort of proportional unit in it, so you're not having those couple trigger re-renders. So I've never run into performance problems with that, but it's definitely is something to be aware of.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Wes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.